Here you go, sir.
Blessing thought she
Thank
was
you very
just being a
much.
good neighbor, sharing a plate with a
Thank you
man
very
who looked
much.
like he had forgotten the taste of a home-cooked meal. But the small act of kindness she offered from her blue-painted stall would ignite a fire that reached the highest skyscrapers in the city. Because the man she saw as a struggler was actually Edu, a man whose signature could move billions, but whose heart was starving for something money couldn't buy. Then the noise of the market seems to fade. A man walks up. He is Tony, or so he says. He wears a shirt that has seen too many washes and shoes caked in the dust of the road. His eyes are tired, but they hold a strange, silent power. He reaches for his pockets, his fingers finding only lint. Blessing doesn't wait for him to speak. She sees the hunger, and more importantly, she sees the man. "Sit," she commands with a soft, firm smile, sliding a steaming plate toward him. And this stall, kindness is the only currency you need. The sun hung like a heavy brass coin in the sky, baking the red dust of the market until the air itself felt thick and gritty. Inside her small wooden shed, Blessing moved with the practiced rhythm of a woman who had long ago made peace with the heat. The steam from the large pots of jollof rice rose in humid waves, clinging to her skin and dampening the hair at her temples. But she didn't slow down. To her, every stir of the heavy wooden spoon was a prayer, and every measured scoop of spices was a brick in the wall she was building between her life and the biting edge of poverty. Business had been slow that morning. She watched the crowds drift past, their eyes flitting over her sky blue stall before being pulled away by the louder shouts of the electronics vendors or the flash of colorful fabrics next door. Blessing wiped her hands on her apron, her gaze lingering on the small metal tin hidden beneath the counter. Inside were the crumpled notes she had managed to save. Not quite enough to meet the landlord's new demand, but more than she had yesterday. Her rent was more than just a bill. It was the price of her independence, the cost of keeping this small sanctuary where she was the queen of her own hearth. Despite the ache in her lower back and the salt of sweat stinging her eyes, there was no bitterness in her movements. When a young boy from the nearby tailoring shop ran past, looking faint from the midday glare, she reached for a plastic cup and filled it with cold water from her personal flask. She didn't ask for a coin. She simply handed it over with a nod that said she understood what it was to be thirsty. "Blessing, you are too kind for this market," a neighboring vendor called out, shaking her head. "Kindness doesn't fill a rent tin." Blessing only smiled, her focus returning to the bubbling stew. "Hunger doesn't wait for a full tin, sister," she replied softly. She believed in the harvest of the heart, that the energy she poured into her food would somehow find its way back to her. She wasn't looking for a miracle, only the strength to keep her fire burning for one more day. As the afternoon shadows began to stretch long and thin across the dirt floor, she adjusted her apron and stood tall. She was a woman of soft strength, a woman who knew that while the world outside was harsh and transactional, the world inside her stall would always remain a place of warmth and quiet sincerity. The next day, just as the sun began its slow descent, the man returned. He walked through the thick market crowd like a ghost, unnoticed by the shouting vendors and the rushing laborers, but Blessing saw him the moment he rounded the corner. He wore the same dusty shirt as before, the fabric clinging to his shoulders in a way that spoke of long hours under the open sky, yet there was something about the way he moved that stopped her mid-motion. Even in his worn shoes, he didn't slouch like the other men who spent their days hauling heavy crates. He carried himself with a perfect, effortless posture, his back straight and his head held with a quiet dignity that seemed to defy his tattered appearance. As he approached the sky blue stall, he didn't look at the ground in shame for his empty pockets. Instead, his gaze was steady and calm, holding a depth that Blessing couldn't quite name. "You're back," she said, her voice a soft melody over the distant roar of the market. She was already reaching for a clean ceramic plate, her hands moving with a grace that mirrored his own. "I am," he replied. His voice was a rich, low timbre, refined and steady, like the hum of a well-tuned engine. He took the same seat in the corner, his presence filling the small space in a way that felt both overwhelming and strangely comforting. Blessing set the steaming plate of jollof rice and fried plantains before him. As she watched him pick up the cutlery, she noticed his hands. They were calloused, yes, but the way he held the fork was precise, almost elegant. He ate slowly, savoring every grain, as if this humble meal was the most important event of his day. She stayed busy wiping the counter nearby, stealing glances at him. He didn't speak much, but he didn't have to. There was a tension in the silence between them, a magnetic pull that made the air in the stall feel lighter yet more charged. Every time their eyes met, she felt a flicker of something she couldn't explain, a sense that this man, with his dusty clothes and his regal bearing, was a puzzle she wasn't yet allowed to solve. He was a man hiding immense power behind a mask of poverty, and for the first time in her life, Blessing found herself more interested in the stranger than the sale. When he finally stood to leave, offering a small, respectful nod, the stall felt colder the moment he stepped back into the dust of the street. The heavy iron gates of the estate swung open with a silent, mechanical precision that always felt more like a warning than a welcome. As the black sedan glided up the winding driveway, Adu leaned his head against the cool glass of the window, watching the manicured hedges blur into a streak of perfect, artificial green. By the time the car came to a halt in front of the towering limestone portico, the sun had vanished, leaving the world in a bruised purple twilight. Stepping into the grand foyer, his heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floors, the sound echoing upward into the vaulted ceiling. The mansion was a masterpiece of glass, steel, and stone, illuminated by hidden lights that made every surface glow with a cold, expensive brilliance. But as Adu stood in the center of the hall, the silence of the house pressed against his ears like a physical weight. He walked through the vast living area, past original paintings that cost more than the entire market where he had spent his afternoon. He looked at the sleek designer furniture and the crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen rain, but none of it felt real. In his mind, he was still sitting on a rickety wooden stool in a sky-blue shed, the air thick with the scent of spices and the sound of a woman's soft humming voice. He moved to the kitchen, a sprawling space of industrial-grade appliances and granite islands, and opened a refrigerator filled with imported delicacies he had no desire to touch. The hollow ache in his chest had returned, sharper than before. Here, in this 12-hectare palace, he was Sir Adu, a man of immense power and unreachable status. But to the world behind these walls, he was merely a ghost in a gold-plated cage. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the dark expanse of his private gardens, his reflection staring back at him from the glass. He looked at his hands, now clean and devoid of the market's dust, yet they felt strangely empty. The luxury surrounding him felt thin, like a veil that could tear at any moment. For the first time in years, the silence of his home didn't feel like peace, it felt like a void. He realized then that the only time he had felt truly alive that day was when he was sitting in a dusty stall, being treated not as a king, but simply as a man who was hungry. Turning away from the view, he left the lights on in the empty room and headed for the stairs, already counting the hours until he could return to the only place that felt like home. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt increasingly like a shared secret. Each afternoon, as the market's roar reached its peak, Tony would appear at the blue wooden stall. He didn't demand attention or carry the air of a man used to being served. He simply sat in his corner, a silent anchor in the middle of Blessing's storm. Between the rush of customers, the space between them began to fill with words, small at first, then deep and steady like a rising tide. Blessing found herself talking to him in a way she never spoke to the regular market gossips. As she stirred her pots, she told him about her dream, not of gold or mansions, but of a brick-and-mortar restaurant with white tablecloths and windows that let in the morning light. She spoke of the recipes passed down from her grandmother, flavors that carried the history of her people, and her desire to create a place where no one ever had to leave hungry just because their pockets were empty. "I don't need much," she said one afternoon, wiping a smudge of flour from her cheek as she looked at the steam rising from the rice. "I just want to know that I built something that lasts, something that belongs to me." Tony watched her, his unreadable eyes softening. He saw the soft strength in the way she handled a difficult customer with a firm but polite word, and the way she kept her stall spotless despite the red dust that tried to claim everything in Enugu. He realized that while he had spent his life building empires of glass and cold numbers, Blessing was building an empire of the soul. She didn't have a board of directors or a billion-dollar hedge fund, yet she carried a mountain of responsibility on her shoulders without letting it crush her spirit. "You have a gift, Blessing," Tony said softly, his voice cutting through the clatter of distant pans. "Most people look at a plate of food and see a price. You see the person eating it." Blessing paused, the wooden spoon still in her hand. For a moment, the market seemed to go silent. She looked at this man in his dusty shirt and felt a strange, terrifying warmth in her chest. He wasn't looking at her as a vendor or a convenience. He was looking at her as if he truly saw the woman beneath the apron. She didn't know then that he was a man who owned half the city's skyline. She only knew that for the first time in a long time, she felt understood. In that small, humid stall, the billionaire learned that true wealth wasn't what you kept in a vault, but the quiet sincerity of a woman who dreamt of feeding the world. While the air in Blessing's stall remained thick with the scent of spices and the warmth of genuine connection, 30 miles away, the atmosphere was frozen in a state of clinical panic. Inside the glass-walled boardroom of the Edu Group headquarters, the air conditioning hummed with a sharp, metallic edge that did nothing to cool the rising tempers of the men and women gathered around the mahogany table. At the head of the table sat Lady Chenair, Edu's aunt, her fingers tapping a rhythmic, impatient tattoo against the polished wood. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the faces of the top-tier security consultants who stood before her, looking unusually small. 3 weeks, she said, her voice a low, dangerous silk. "One of the most recognizable men on this continent disappears, and you tell me he has vanished into thin air? He is not a ghost. He is a multi-billion-dollar entity." The lead security chief wiped a bead of sweat from his temple. "He's been deliberate, ma'am. He left his phones, his cars, his trackers. He's moving in the shadows, likely in the city's outskirts. We've checked the private islands, the resorts in the east, the luxury hideaways in the north. Nothing." "Because he isn't at a resort," one of the board members snapped, throwing a folder onto the table. "The market is reacting. Stock prices are fluctuating because the CEO is unavailable for comment. If the international investors catch wind that he's had a mental break, or worse, been abducted, we lose everything we've built in a decade." Lady Chenair stood up, her silk dress rustling like a coiled snake. To her, Edu's disappearance wasn't a cry for help, it was a security breach. She didn't see a nephew suffocating under the weight of an empire. She saw a missing asset that needed to be retrieved and recalibrated. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city that her family practically owned. "He is somewhere humble," she whispered, more to herself than the room. "He always had a streak of his father's sentimentality. He's trying to find something he thinks he lost." She turned back to the room, her gaze icy. "Double the surveillance in the low-income districts. Check every market, every roadside inn, every place a man of his stature would never dream of being seen. Find him before the press does. And when you find him, do not ask him to come home. Bring him." The board members exchanged nervous glances. The stakes were no longer just about a man's peace of mind, they were about the survival of a financial titan. As the high society machinery groaned into high gear, the hunt for the missing billionaire shifted from the palaces of the elite to the dusty streets of the common man, closing in on the quiet blue stall where Edu had finally found his breath. The afternoon had been particularly peaceful, the kind of quiet that felt like a gift. Tony was leaning against the wooden frame of the stall, watching Blessing pack away the last of the fried fish. He was mid-sentence, telling her a story about a bird he had seen in the park, when the air in the market suddenly changed. It wasn't a gradual shift, it was a violent rupture of the sanctuary they had built. The distant roar of the market was drowned out by the synchronized scream of high-performance engines. 3 massive jet-black SUVs tore through the narrow dirt alleyway, their polished chassis reflecting the grit of the market like dark mirrors. They skidded to a halt in front of the sky-blue stall, kicking up a blinding cloud of red dust that coated Blessing's carefully wiped counters. Before the dust could even settle, the doors flew open. Men in sharp charcoal-gray suits and coiled earpieces spilled out with a precision that was terrifying to behold. The market vendors fell silent, their voices dying in their throats as they stared at the display of raw, unyielding power. Blessing froze, her hands still clutching a cleaning rag. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she looked at the men, then at Tony. But Tony wasn't Tony anymore. His posture, which she had once thought was merely graceful, now looked like a shield. His face had gone completely blank, the warmth she had come to know vanishing behind a mask of cold, unreachable authority. One of the men, clearly the leader, stepped forward. He ignored the smell of jollof rice and the humble plastic flowers decorating the shed. He stopped exactly 3 feet from the man in the dusty shirt and bowed his head deeply, a gesture of absolute submission that looked surreal in the middle of the crowded market. "Sir, adieu," the man said, his voice carrying a crisp, metallic edge that cut through the silence. "The board is in emergency session. Lady Chinan has ordered your immediate return. The perimeter is secure. We are ready to move." Blessing felt the world tilt. She looked at the dusty shirt she had seen every day, then at the fleet of vehicles that cost more than anyone in this market would earn in a lifetime. The word "sir" echoed in her mind, a sharp blade severing the connection they had shared. "Adieu," she whispered, the name feeling heavy and foreign on her tongue. The man turned to her. For a fleeting second, the cold mask cracked, and she saw Tony, the man who loved her grandmother's recipes and talked about birds. But then the security detail stepped between them, a wall of black silk and muscle. "Wait," he started to say, reaching out a hand, but the lead guard was already opening the door to the middle SUV. "The press is 10 minutes behind us, sir. We must go now," the guard urged. Blessing watched as the man she had fed for free, the man who had sat on her rickety stool and listened to her dreams, was ushered into the back of the darkened vehicle. As the doors slammed shut with a heavy final thud, the SUVs roared back to life, disappearing as quickly as they had arrived. Blessing stood alone in the red dust, the silence of the market now feeling like a deafening roar of betrayal. The dust kicked up by the heavy tires lingered in the air long after the black SUVs had vanished, coating the blue paint of the stall in a fine gray film. For a long time, Blessing didn't move. She stood with her cleaning rag limp in her hand, staring at the empty space where the man she knew was Tony had been ushered away like a prisoner of his own importance. Around her, the market was beginning to awaken from its stunned silence. Whispers rippled through the neighboring stalls, sharp and jagged, as vendors pointed toward her, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and mockery. "Blessing, you've been feeding a king," someone shouted, but the words felt like a slap. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her chest felt as though it had been hollowed out, leaving a cold, aching void where the warmth of the last few weeks had lived. She began to move with a sudden, frantic energy, her hands trembling as she grabbed the heavy wooden shutters of her stall. She didn't care that there was still half a pot of jollof rice left, or that she hadn't counted the day's meager earnings. She just needed the world to stop looking at her. As the shutters slammed down, one by one, the darkness of the shed swallowed her. Only then, behind the locked door of her sanctuary, did the first sob break through. She sank onto the rickety stool where he had sat just an hour ago, her head falling into her hands. The betrayal didn't feel like a secret. It felt like a theft. She thought of all the times she had shared her deepest fears, the nights she had stayed awake worrying about rent, the dreams she had confessed about her grandmother's recipes. He had listened to it all with those tired eyes, pretending to be a man who understood the weight of a struggle he could have ended with a flick of his wrist. She felt used, not for her money, but for her heart. To her, those meals were a sacrifice, a piece of her survival handed over to a stranger out of pure, honest kindness. To him, she realized with a fresh surge of pain, it was likely just a vacation, a quaint experience in the life of a woman who didn't know he was playing a part. Hunger is older than pride, she had told him, but as the tears tracked through the flour and salt on her face, Blessing realized that pride was far more painful than hunger. He had walked into her world and taken the only thing she had left that wasn't for sale, her trust. Outside, the rain began to fall, a sudden unugu downpour that drummed against the wooden roof, drowning out the sound of a woman weeping for the friend she had lost to a billionaire's lie. The silence in Blessing's life lasted for 3 days, until the roar of the engines returned. This time there was no dust, no sirens, and no fleet of SUVs. A single silver car stopped at the edge of the market, and Edu stepped out alone. He wasn't wearing the dusty shirt of Tony or the sharp silk of a CEO. He wore a simple linen tunic, his face stripped of the mask he had worn in the SUVs. Blessing stood behind her counter, her hands resting on the wood she had scrubbed until it was raw. She didn't greet him. She didn't smile. "I didn't come to explain the money," Edu said, his voice reaching her across the empty stalls of the closing market. "I came to show you why I stayed." He reached into his pocket and placed a small leather-bound book on the counter. Blessing hesitated, then opened it. She expected to see bank statements or photos of glass towers. Instead, she found Polaroids, blurry, candid shots of a life hidden from the world. There was a photo of him sitting on a curb in a small village, laughing with an old man over a game of drafts. Another showed him sleeping on a bus, his head lolling against a window. There was a photo of a sunset over a dusty field, and finally, a picture of a sky-blue stall, her stall, taken from across the street. "In my world," Edu whispered, stepping closer, "everyone looks at me and sees a ladder to climb or a vault to empty. For 10 years, I haven't been a person, I've been a price tag." He pointed to the photo of her stall. "When I sat here and you gave me that first plate without asking for a single kobo, you weren't feeding a billionaire. You were feeding a man who was starving to remember who he was. You were the only person in years who looked at me and didn't want anything but for me to be full." Blessing looked from the book to his eyes. She saw the tired eyes again, but this time they were pleading. He wasn't showing her his wealth, he was showing her his poverty, the emotional hollowness that all the marble in Enugu couldn't fill. "I lied about my name," Edu said, his voice trembling, "but I never lied about how the food tasted, and I never lied about how it felt to hear you talk about your grandmother." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the counter. "This is my real world, Blessing, not the jets. Just the moments where I got to be human. You are the biggest part of that world now." Blessing looked at the photo of her own humble shed through his eyes. It didn't look small or poor in the picture. It looked like a lighthouse. The cold weight in her chest began to thaw, replaced by a tentative, fragile understanding. She realized that while he had the power to buy the market, he had come to her because she possessed the one thing he couldn't own, a piece of the truth. Slowly, she turned her hand over, letting her palm meet his. The sun was beginning to set over the market, casting long amber shadows across the blue wooden stall, but for the first time in days, the coming darkness didn't feel heavy. Blessing looked at Edu, really looked at him, and saw that the man who had sat on her rickety stool wasn't a stranger anymore. He was a person who had been lost, and in her humble shed, he had found his way back to himself. "The world of private jets and boardrooms, it's not my world, Edu," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "I know how to handle a hungry crowd in Enugu, but I don't know how to handle a life where everything has a price tag." Edu tightened his grip on her hand, his thumb tracing the calluses on her palm with a reverence that made her breath hitch. "I don't want you to change from my world. I want my world to learn something from yours. I want us to build something where honesty is the only currency we use." Blessing exhaled a long, shaky breath, the last of her resentment dissolving into the evening air. She looked back at her stall, the place where she had fought so hard for her independence.
She wasn't giving it up. She was simply expanding her horizon. "I'm not promising it will be easy," she whispered, a small, genuine smile finally tugging at her lips. A few hours later, the red dust of Enugu fell away beneath them. Blessing sat in the plush leather seat of the private jet, her hand still tucked firmly into Edu's. Through the window, the city lights looked like spilled jewels on a dark velvet cloth, shrinking until the vastness of the sky was all that remained. There were no cameras here, no security guards standing between them, and no masks to wear. As the plane leveled off among the stars, Edu leaned over and kissed her forehead. He wasn't the billionaire, and she wasn't just the food vendor. They were simply two people who had found truth in a steaming plate of rice and a shared silence. Ahead of them lay a future that was uncertain and complex, but as Blessing leaned her head on his shoulder, she knew that as long as they kept their feet grounded in the sincerity they had found in a small blue stall, they would never be lost again. Under the soft glow of the cabin lights, they flew together towards a new dawn, leaving the shadows of the past far below.